Hello, my name is Jacob Gibson, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the downfall of NASCAR. Now, I will be mainly focusing on the years from 2003 to 2018. However, in order for you guys to have what I feel like is a good understanding, we need to take a look back in time to see how NASCAR got its start. So, believe it or not, NASCAR's biggest pioneers of the sport back in the day were bootleggers during the Prohibition era. Bootleggers such as Junior Johnson, Roy Hall, and others would build cars that were meant to outrun the police while transporting moonshine. Then, in 1938, the first big stock car race would be held in front of 20,000 fans. In 1941, Roy Hall would go on to win the National Stock Car Championship. Now, from 1941 to 1945, there really wasn't very many races, and if there were, they weren't documented. While it is very obvious with the elephant in the room, World War II was going on, so chances are racing wasn't a number one priority. However, in 1945, they did eventually start to pick back up racing again, which meant that the police were kind of catching on. So the police actually banned 5 racers, including Hall, for liquor hauling violations. So the bad part was, for the police anyways, is that they announced this at the track while Hall was there, and the 30,000 fans at Lakewood Speedway started chanting for Hall, ultimately forcing the police's hand into letting him race, and he did go on to win it. And then in 1947, Bill France began to recruit these bootleggers to race for him in the Virginias and in the Carolinas. In December of 1947, Bill France would gather all of the lead stock car drivers, mechanics, and owners in Daytona Beach, Florida. This gathering would go over the rules and end up with the formation of the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, also known as NASCAR. Now, this is the Big Bang. In my opinion, and as well as a lot of others, this was the Big Bang for NASCAR, which happened during February of 1979. The Daytona 500 was aired live on CBS, which was really big because that hadn't really happened before, and if it was aired, it was mainly only in the South. And at the time, not every single race was even bothered to be aired live. Now, NASCAR kind of had the perfect storm. It did rain earlier on in the day, but the track ended up drying just in time for the race to start, as well as up north, there was a huge blizzard that snowed in most people, creating new viewers that NASCAR really wasn't anticipating. And on top of it, to add the cherry, they had a great race. With the final lap, the Allison brothers were beating and banging, and they ended up wrecking each other. So Richard Petty, in third place from a half lap back, ended up winning the race. The Allison brothers then proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other, as brothers would, especially if you're going to wreck your own brother to win the race, which the Daytona 500, for those of you that don't know, is kind of like our Super Bowl. And this race put NASCAR on the map. We were in headlines for a very, very long time, and NASCAR kind of felt like they finally had their footing. So, to now get to my main person that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about the leadership role of Brian France, who is the CEO from NASCAR, or for NASCAR, I'm sorry, from 2003 to 2018. Both his grandfather and father, Bill France Sr. and Bill France Jr., were also the CEOs of NASCAR. I mean, he had been around NASCAR his whole life, so it's really no surprise that he would inherit the role of being the CEO of NASCAR. And to be honest, NASCAR has always been a family affair, whether it's the leadership role or drivers. So, for instance, father and son combinations of Ned Jarrett, Dale Earnhardt Sr., Dale Earnhardt Jr., Chase Elliott, Bill Elliott. And then for brothers, I mean, man, you have Michael Waltrip, Darrell Waltrip, and the Labonte brothers of Terry Labonte and Bobby Labonte. So it's really no surprise that in this family affair of a sport, Brian France would inherit the CEO. So I'm first going to go ahead and talk about the good that Brian France did, and that was to reach new demographics and become more mainstream in the 2000s. NASCAR would attract pretty big sponsors for their drivers due to NASCAR's amazing marketing tactics. And like I said, NASCAR was able to reach new demographics, and that was in credit due to NASCAR being able to be in touch with Hollywood, producing movies like Talladega Nights, which, while although that's more of a stereotype, it's better than nothing, right? And the beloved Cars movie. I mean, who can forget? Honestly, one of my favorite movies of all time. How can you not like it? And NASCAR would actually become so popular in the 2000s that they would have what would be called an open wheel invasion, where Formula One and IndyCar drivers would come over and try and race. And some of the biggest names I can remember is Juan Pablo Montoya and Scott Speed from Formula One, And IndyCar, you have Dario Franchitti and Sam Hornish Jr. So when I was talking about NASCAR's marketing strategy, their entire marketing strategy has been win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Now, this idea kind of came back when NASCAR first started, when their cars were traditionally stock and kind of what you could see on any lot of a parking lot of a car dealership. And the idea was that whatever car won that race on Sunday would sell in the car dealerships on Monday. So this kind of carried over into the more modern day esque of the 2000s, where big name sponsors would be sponsoring stock cars and teams in hopes of if they won on Sunday, they would sell more on Monday. So if you even look at this alone, on the left you have the DeWalt Tools car. On the right you can see M&M's, Office Depot, Home Depot, Miller Lite, Army, UPS, Irwin Tools, Pepsi, Lowe's, Waste Management, Kellogg's, State, Bass Pro Shops, AAA Insurance, Budweiser, Jack, FedEx, Napa, Tide. There's Menards in the back as well. And the other great thing is that NASCAR did a good job of finding sponsors that would be willing to compete with each other solely because of this strategy of win on Sunday, sell on Monday. So if you look in the top right and the bottom left, you have McDonald's and Burger King. Top left and the bottom right, Budweiser, Coors Light. I mean, you just had all these sponsors that were competing against one another in hopes that that car would win that they're sponsoring and bump up their sales that week. So, like I said earlier, the Cars movie was huge for NASCAR, but the cooler part about it, in my opinion, was that the cast kind of resembles a lot of the real life drivers in NASCAR. So, for instance, in the top left, you have Daryl Cartrip, which was an announcer during the Cars movie. Well, that guy's real name is Darrell Waltrip, and he was an announcer for Fox who was a retired Hall of Fame NASCAR driver. And during his prime, he drove a car like this, and in the movie, Darrell Cartrip has number 17. Darrell Waltrip also drove the number 17 in real life. And on the top right, you have the 43 car of the King, also known as Richard Petty in real life, and his nickname is the King. On the bottom right, you have Chicks Hicks, which, in my opinion, models Dale Earnhardt Sr. From the mustache to the body style to his aggressive driving style, everything to me personally screams Dale Sr. Now, on the bottom left, that one's kind of a tricky one, and the reason why is because some people believe that Lightning McQueen resembles Jimmy Johnson. But for me personally, I believe that Lightning McQueen resembles Jeff Gordon. Because Jeff Gordon's most dominant days were in the Gen 4 era, and he raced against Dale Sr. a lot, and Jeff Gordon's first race was Richard Petty, the King's last race. Next up, we have viewership. Like I said, viewership was booming in the mid-2000s, so from 2000 to 2005, NASCAR would see a massive increase in viewership, with 2005 season being the highest viewership with nearly 8.5 million people watching every single race that season. For those of you that don't know, that's 36 races a season, and NASCAR races every Sunday. So that's a long period of time to have that many people tuned in every weekend. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to the bad. Brian France would implement the chase for the 2004 season, which is NASCAR's version of the playoffs. After 2005, NASCAR's viewership would continue to plummet. In 2007, they implemented the Car of Tomorrow. In 2008, you had the 2008 Brickyard 400 mess up, and as well as the 2008 Brickyard recession. Now, to talk about the chase, so Brian France was trying to go after the casual fan, the fan that hadn't really yet discovered NASCAR, but also didn't really have any interest to discover it. So, with this idea of trying to make NASCAR more like a stick and ball sport, if you will, because every other major sport in America is a stick and ball sport, and they have playoffs, so ideally, in a perfect world, why wouldn't the playoffs work for us? So, with that being said, after 26 races, the top 10 drivers in the points would have a reset, and they would all be set equal. And then for the last 10 races, whichever driver came out on top of those 10 drivers would be crowned the champion. In 2004, the first year of it, Kurt Busch would nudge out Jimmy Johnson by 8 points for the title. Like I said, viewership was still declining. NASCAR would peak in 2005 and would be on a steady decline all the way until 2020. NASCAR has lost over 5 million viewers in 13 years. And to put that in perspective, more people have stopped watching NASCAR in the last 13 years than people that are still watching it. I mean, it's just not a good look. Now, this is kind of an interesting one. The Car of Tomorrow. In 2007, Brian France introduced the Car of Tomorrow, which was developed in 2005, 2006, and 2007. The goal was to create the safest car NASCAR had ever seen because in the late 90s and early 2000s, NASCAR had a lot of deaths, but they were kind of chalked up as, well, racing's always going to be a dangerous sport, and every driver accepts that risk anytime he steps into the car. And nothing was really ever done. NASCAR, in my opinion, was really reactive to the situation, and I think that's why the Car of Tomorrow had the main idea of safety, which, to be completely honest with you, the car is really safe. Other than the wing on the back that caused cars to get airborne, the car was extremely safe, and in 2010, they would exchange that funny looking wing for a shark fin instead, which no longer allowed the cars to just randomly catch airborne as soon as they were faced backwards. But the problem was, in my opinion, they're a complete eyesore, and they didn't race as great as they did in the Gen 4 car. And in all honesty, the Gen 4 was kind of the peak of NASCAR's racing. So, with not having good racing, certainly not being the best of looks on the eyes, and as well as drivers didn't speak positively about the car. For instance, this is the first race that the Car of Tomorrow debuted in, which was at Bristol Motor Speedway in 2007, and Kyle Busch in the number 5 barely edged out Jeff Burton for the victory in the number 31. And then when Kyle Busch went to victory lane, the first thing that he said about the cars was that they suck while being interviewed in victory lane. And that took over the headlines like no tomorrow. But I'm not going to 1000% put the blame on Kyle Busch because, yes, at the time he was young and dumb. I put some of the blame on Brian France as well because Dale Jr. stated on the Dale Jr. download earlier this year in November with Brian France for his interview that Brian France didn't communicate with the drivers and the drivers didn't really have any say in what was going on with the development of the car tomorrow. I mean, that's like making a new rule in the NBA, NFL, or the NHL, or the MLB and not asking for the players' input. It's a recipe for disaster. So, and Brian France did admit on the Dale Jr. download that it was a mistake and he should have done a better job communicating with the teams and listening to the driver's perspective. Now we're going to get on to the 2008 Brickyard 400. For those of you that don't know, the Brickyard 400 has always been a crown jewel event in NASCAR. It takes place at Indianapolis Motor Speedway just like the Indy 500 does. The only difference is that race for us, I believe, happens sometime in August and it's only 400 miles instead of 500. In 2008, NASCAR and Goodyear brought such a bad tire that it completely ruined the race. Pit stops were required about every 10 laps, the longest run of the race was 12, and the final dash to the finish was just 7. To put this in perspective, the race is 160 laps, so that means almost every 10 laps they had to throw a caution because somebody was blowing a tire and going head on into the fence. Now, Indy has always and forever will be a really big racing city, and Indiana will always be a big racing state. And the fans are extremely loyal to what they see and what they like. I mean, if you look at the Indy 500 this year alone, they had over 300,000 people in attendance. So as you can imagine, from 2008 to 2009, the race attendance declined from 240,000 to 180,000, the steepest one-year drop in the race history, which is very bad, but it continues to get worse because in 2013, the last year that NASCAR released attendance figures there, only 70,000 fans showed up. That's a huge decline in only 5 years' time. And while although maybe one can't necessarily say that that was Brian France's fault because it was Goodyear's responsibility, Brian France didn't take any ownership, neither did Goodyear, on putting on a bad show, and the fans let them know that they weren't coming back. And you can't burn a bridge, or you can't build a bridge that's already been burned, and Brian France tried to do that, and it didn't work. Now, this is not something that I believe that is Brian France's fault, but I felt like was necessary in putting in there as to what contributed to NASCAR's downfall, which is the 2008 recession. With NASCAR's core audience mainly being blue collar, and with the 2008 recession, it just made it hard on people to attend races, and this was something, like I said, that is out of Brian France and NASCAR's control, but I believe it's worth mentioning it. Now we're going to get on to the ugly. Brian France continuously tried to make NASCAR a stick and ball sport. The chase format became manipulated. The chase format keeps changing. Lots of big sponsors left the sport in the 2010s. Viewership continues to go down. And the worst date of them all, August 6th, 2018. So, when I say the chase is being manipulated, in 2013, in the final race to make the playoffs, Clint Bowyer would try and help out his teammate by purposely self spinning. That self spin would allow his teammate to go ahead and advance into the playoffs and knock a driver out. Right after the race, Dale Earnhardt Jr. said that that was one of the craziest looking spins he's ever seen. He just thought it was funny. And then they kept analyzing it after post race, and it looked very suspicious. Later on, evidence on the radio came out that it was on purpose because early on in the race they were talking about how Martin Truex Jr. wasn't in it, and then they kept giving Clint Bowyer cues like, oh man, I bet it's getting hot in there, and oh, I bet your arm itches. Which, this exposed how easy the championship can be manipulated. And unfortunately for Michael Waltrip Racing, which is who Clint Bowyer races for, they went out of business not even 2 seasons later. And Martin Truex Jr. left the team after that season, and Napa, who was a huge sponsor for Martin Truex Jr., took their funding and went to Chase Elliott instead, which forced Michael Waltrip Racing to close their doors. And on top of that, it was a really big black eye for NASCAR because NASCAR had to change the rules to allow 13 drivers into the chase instead of 12 at the time. And it was really controversial on what to do. But unfortunately, instead of just having a clean race to the chase, you had it manipulated, and it was a big black eye, and it also exposed how easy it is to really manipulate the championship. Now, I will also put some blame as to why the chase didn't resonate well with fans due to Jimmy Johnson, but I won't put the blame on him because honestly, he went out there and blew everybody's doors off, winning 5 championships in a row from 2006 to 2010, and he would also win the championship in 2013 and 2016 as well. Now, the reason why I do put some of the blame on him, even though it's just not his fault for being that good of a competitor, was him and Chad Knaus, his crew chief, would do really well in the beginning of the season, and then in the middle of the season, they would test like crazy. They would experiment. They would kind of just be mid-pack because the chase format, once you hit race 26, the points reset. Everybody's equal. So if you have your car dialed in for those 10 races, that's all that really matters in winning it. So after that, Brian France would be kind of forced to produce something different, something that would be nothing but pure chaos, if you will. And in 2014, he would implement a win and you're in playoffs, meaning that if you want to race from race 1 to race 26, you already had a guaranteed spot in the playoffs. This kind of hoped that it would promote winning more instead of drivers being conservative and going for points. Which, I mean, it did. Drivers were a little bit more ballsy, and for better or worse, the racecraft has changed, and guys are a lot more aggressive than what they used to be. And for the playoff format, he would introduce this March Madness style, which meant that after every 3 races, 4 drivers would be eliminated, and for each round that was done, the points would be reset. And once you got down to the final race, there would be 4 drivers that had a shot of winning the title. Highest finishing position out of those 4 drivers would go on to win the race. Now, I mean, this alone just sounds blatantly confusing. I mean, Formula One has finally started to gain some traction in the United States, and I've had people come up and ask me how does NASCAR points formats work just because they see me wearing a NASCAR shirt? And I can explain it pretty well, but they don't understand. I mean, it's confusing, especially because Formula One, it's pretty simple. The top 10 drivers in points get points. And then they try to go ahead and come over to NASCAR, and it doesn't make any sense. And to be completely honest with you, in 2014, I will admit that the chase was pretty entertaining, even though I was a Jeff Gordon fan and it broke my heart seeing him not being able to win. It was still fairly entertaining. But now being on the 8th season of it, there's just been nothing but a bunch of forced Game 7 moments, and after a while, it just kind of left a sour taste in my mouth, and I believe that resonates the same way for a lot of fans as well. So, at what point do we have to look ourselves in the mirror and go, well, do we want entertainment or do we want to reward the best driver? But I will say that with all this chaos, Brian France did get what he wanted. There has only been 2 drivers to repeat a championship in this format, which is clearly way better than one guy going on a tear and winning 5 of them straight. The next thing we have to talk about is sponsorship loss. If you look at all these sponsors in this picture, none of them exist in NASCAR anymore. And part of it is because of the business model that NASCAR has now, where the revenue from the races are mainly going to the tracks. And same thing with the TV deals, they're mainly going to the tracks and not to the teams. So this kind of makes the teams more reliant on the sponsors for funding in order to have a fast car. Well, once sponsors started dropping, I mean, the price has to be raised. So more and more sponsors would continue to drop, and as you've seen, we just don't have the big sponsors that we did in the early 2000s. And I don't believe it's anything to do with the whole you win on Sunday, sell on Monday kind of thing. It's just the prices are too high and it's just not worth the risk anymore. And unfortunately, now with Mars, which is the chocolate company, they're leaving now after 2022, which is nuts because I mean, every kid can probably remember seeing like an M&M's car and going, "Oh wow, that's cool." Or well, at least NASCAR fans can tell you like, "Oh, I remember seeing the M&M's car as a kid and I thought it was the coolest thing ever." So losing that connection is huge and detrimental to the sport. So down the drain. This is talking about the viewership. Over 700 fewer people per race watched NASCAR in 2018 than they did in 2017. The Cup Series average viewership was over 4 million in 2017 and it fell to 3.3 million in 2018. This drop is significantly larger than what it was from 2016 to 2017 when the Cup Series average viewership dropped by 400,000. Now, I think that there's a lot to play into this, but I do want to say that I believe a good part of this is due to the playoffs and due to this wonky chase system. It doesn't make sense, and after a while it gets tiring, as well as they handicap the horsepower from 850 to capping it at 750. And in all honesty, if you ask any race fan what they want, they're always going to want more horsepower. If you ask any driver what they want, they're always going to want more horsepower. So in all honesty, the racing did see a decline once they lowered the horsepower, as well as the Gen 6 car, which came after the car of tomorrow, had a lot of its flaws, like for instance, you couldn't race side by side without almost wrecking. So now this is the day. This is the picture. This is Brian France's DUI, which happened on August 6, 2018, which in theory was supposed to be a great day. NASCAR's most popular driver, Chase Elliott, finally broke through and grabbed his first win, which is huge because for 2 years he won the most popular driver but couldn't win. I mean, he finished second place 9 times, so clearly he had the consistency. But I mean, it was finally awesome to celebrate NASCAR's most popular driver winning again, which hadn't happened since 2015 when Dale Earnhardt Jr. won his last race. And instead, not even 24 hours later, the headlines were filled with Brian France's DUI. I mean, these were plastered everywhere. NBC, morning talk shows, CBS, CNN, you name it, his face was over it. Brian France did step away from the CEO spotlight after this and hasn't had a role in NASCAR since. So, what is my call to action? NASCAR has yet to recover and become mainstream again. Brian France brought a lot of good to the sport early on, but making NASCAR a stick and ball sport drove away fans. So my main point with this, and as you can tell, I included Formula One Drive to Survive, which has helped them gain a huge amount of success here in the States for viewership and people taking interest in Formula One just in general, is that do not go around chasing the casual fan and making your sport different. The uniqueness of your sport is what helps you thrive. And if you take away your identity to go after something that you don't know is even for sure going to be there, why do that? Your identity is was what helped you have fans in the first place and what will help you to continue to grow and have more fans anyways. So my call to action, especially for Formula One, is don't change too much trying to capture the American fans that are all of a sudden coming out of the woodworks. You did a good job with Drive to Survive, continue that going, but don't change who you are just to try and get more fans and in return piss off all the loyal ones and not be able to recover. So thank you guys for listening to my TED Talk. I appreciate it and have a good rest of your day.